It started like any other call. The buzz of the phone jarred me awake at 3 a.m., the red glow of the digits searing into my retinas. The voice on the other end was Patterson, my supervisor at the Special Investigations Unit. "Get dressed, Campbell. We've got a situation." The room was cold, the kind that seeped into your bones. I threw on my gear, my hands moving automatically, muscle memory from years in the field. Patterson's voice had the kind of edge that spoke of something more than the usual gang violence or drug bust. By the time I got to the precinct, the sun was a mere suggestion on the horizon, casting a weak glow through the smog. Patterson was waiting, his face set in a grim mask. "An alien ship crashed near the old industrial park. We're the first response." I swallowed the lump in my throat. We'd had close calls before, UFO sightings and weird artifacts. But an actual crash? This was new territory. We loaded up into the armored van, the tires crunching over the gravel as we sped towards the site. The air inside was tense, everyone silent, each man lost in his own thoughts. I focused on the rhythm of the road, the bumps and jolts keeping me grounded. The crash site was a nightmare. Metal shards jutted out of the ground like skeletal fingers. The ship itself was a twisted mass of blackened metal, half buried in the earth. My first instinct was to search for survivors, but the scene screamed at me to be cautious. Patterson led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. As we approached the wreckage, we saw bodies. Dozens of them lay there, their forms twisted. Their skin was mottled and leathery, faces twisted in expressions of agony or rage, horns and fangs glinting in the dim light. They looked like demons from medieval paintings, twisted beings with goat-like legs, wings torn and tattered, and faces that seemed to mock human features with exaggerated cruelty. "Jesus," whispered Martinez, one of our rookies, his voice trembling. "What the hell are these things?" Patterson ignored him, his focus on the task at hand. "Fan out. Look for survivors or any intel we can gather. Be careful." I moved cautiously. The ground was slick with something viscous, making each step treacherous. I knelt beside one of the bodies, resisting the urge to recoil. Up close, the details were even more disturbing. Eyes bulging and red, skin that felt like cold, rough leather, and hands twisted into grotesque claws. "Campbell, over here!" called out Simmons, my partner. I joined him by a part of the wreckage that seemed to be a control console, or what was left of it. The symbols on the panels were indecipherable, a series of jagged lines and curves that hurt to look at. Amidst the wreckage, a blinking light caught my eye. A data core, perhaps? Before I could examine it further, Simmons nudged me and pointed to the ground. Tracks. Not human. They were deep, irregular impressions, like something with hooves and claws had scrambled away from the crash site. "Looks like some of them made it out," Simmons muttered. The realization sank in. This wasn't just a crash site, it was a containment breach. My mind whirled, thoughts tumbling over each other. If these creatures were anything like the ones depicted in our darkest myths, then we were in deep trouble. "Patterson, we've got tracks here," I called out. He joined us, his face grim as he studied the prints. "All right, Campbell, Simmons, you two follow these tracks. The rest of you, keep searching the wreckage for anything useful." Simmons and I moved out, each step taking us further from the relative safety of the group, deeper into the unknown. The tracks led us into the forest, the dense underbrush making our progress slow and cautious. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but more trees and shadows. We pressed on, the tracks becoming clearer as we moved deeper into the woods. The ground here was softer, the impressions more defined. The sheer size of the print sent a shiver down my spine. Whatever we were tracking was big, and it wasn't alone. More tracks branched off in different directions, suggesting a group had splintered off. Simmons glanced at me, his expression mirroring my own unease. "We need to get back and report this. We're going to need more than just the two of us." I nodded, not needing any more convincing. We turned back, the sense of urgency propelling us faster than we had come. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows darker, the silence heavier. Every step felt like a countdown, each second bringing us closer to whatever nightmare had escaped that ship. As we broke through the tree line and back into the crash site, the sight of our team brought a brief moment of relief. Patterson looked up, his eyes narrowing as he saw us approach. "We've got multiple tracks leading into the forest," I reported. "At least 3 different directions. Whatever these things are, they're out there." Patterson's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the information. "All right, everyone. We're heading back to HQ. This isn't something we can handle alone." We packed up and made our way back to the van. The drive to headquarters felt longer than usual, each mile stretching out as we processed what we had seen. The bodies, the tracks, everything pointed to a situation far beyond our usual scope. At HQ, we were ushered into the briefing room. The stark fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the tired faces of my team. Patterson stood at the head of the table, his expression serious. "We've got a containment breach," he began, his voice steady but grave. "The alien ship that crashed is a prison transport. These aren't just any aliens, they're dangerous, potentially lethal. We need to set up a perimeter around the crash site and extend it to cover the areas where we found the tracks." Martinez's face was pale. "Do we know what we're dealing with? What kind of creatures?" Patterson shook his head. "Not yet, but they resemble demons from human mythology. Horns, fangs, the whole deal. We need to assume the worst." The room was silent, the weight of Patterson's words sinking in. We were facing something out of our darkest nightmares, and it was up to us to contain it. "We're going to need backup," Simmons said. "More men, more firepower." Patterson nodded. "I've already put in the request. In the meantime, we need to act fast. Campbell, you're with me. We'll head back to the site and oversee the perimeter setup. The rest of you, gather intel and prepare for containment." Back at the crash site, we worked quickly to establish a perimeter. Fencing went up, patrols were organized, and sensors were placed to detect any movement. The forest loomed around us, dark and silent as if holding its breath. As the night wore on, I found myself on edge, every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves setting my nerves on fire. Simmons and I took turns patrolling the perimeter, our flashlights cutting through the dense underbrush. During one of my patrols, I came across a set of tracks. They were deeper, fresher, leading away from the crash site and into the heart of the forest. The thought of following them alone made my skin crawl, but I couldn't ignore the possibility of finding one of the escaped creatures. I radioed Patterson. "Sir, I've got fresh tracks here. Heading deeper into the forest. Should we follow?" There was a pause before his voice crackled back. "Negative, Campbell. Fall back to the main site. We'll regroup and decide on the next steps." Reluctantly, I turned back, my thoughts sprinting with the possibilities of what might be hidden in the darkness. When I returned to the crash site, Patterson was waiting, his face lined with worry. "Good call," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "We can't risk losing anyone out there alone. We'll go in together once reinforcements arrive." The hours dragged on, the tension mounting as we waited. Finally, a convoy of vehicles pulled up, bringing fresh troops and much-needed supplies. We gathered in the command center, maps and intel spread out before us. Patterson laid out the plan. We would split into teams, each assigned to track and capture one of the escaped creatures. We were venturing into the unknown, hunting beings that transcended everything we understood about the world. The forest had become a hostile territory, and we were the intruders. With weapons ready and nerves steeled, we moved out, each team taking a different path into the forest. We followed the tracks, our senses on high alert. Every sound made my heart race, the fear of what we might find eroding my sanity. Then we found the first sign, a mangled animal carcass, its flesh torn and bones scattered. The sight was horrific, the stench unbearable. Whatever had done this was close. We pressed on, the tension mounting with each step. Suddenly, movement in the shadows, a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. My flashlight beam caught a face, horns curving from its forehead, eyes burning with red light. It vanished before I could react, leaving behind a trail of blood and fear. "We've got movement," I whispered into my radio, my voice shaking. "Eyes on target. Proceed with caution." The hunt had truly begun. We tracked the creature through the dense forest, following the fresh prints and the occasional smear of blood. The trees loomed around us, their branches seeming to reach out and snatch at our clothing as we moved deeper into the darkness. Simmons was just ahead, his flashlight beam steady and focused. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice tense. "We don't want to lose each other out here." We pressed on, each step bringing us closer to whatever nightmare awaited. The tracks led us to a clearing, and there, amidst the underbrush, we saw it again. The creature stood hunched over, its back turned to us. Its form was nightmarish, twisted and gnarled, with horns spiraling from its head and a tail lashing behind it. The moonlight cast an eerie glow on its leathery skin, highlighting the sharp angles and demonic features. Simmons gestured for us to spread out, to flank the creature. I moved to the right, my eyes never leaving the target. We were within striking distance now, close enough to see the sinew and muscle ripple beneath its hide. Without warning, the creature whipped around, its eyes locking onto mine. They were fiery red, filled with intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. It let out a growl, the sound vibrating through the air like a primal warning. "Open fire!" Simmons shouted, breaking the spell. We unleashed a barrage of bullets, the gunfire shattering the silence. The creature moved with an inhuman speed, dodging between the trees. It was like trying to hit smoke, there one moment, gone the next. Suddenly, it jumped at Simmons, its claws extended. He barely had time to react, raising his rifle in a desperate attempt to block the attack. The force of the impact sent him flying, his weapon clattering to the ground. I fired again, aiming for the creature's center mass. The bullets hit, but they barely slowed it down. It turned its attention to me, and I saw the rage burning in its eyes. It charged, closing the distance in a heartbeat. I braced myself, firing continuously. The creature's claws swiped at me, grazing my arm and sending a shock of pain through my body. Simmons recovered, grabbing his sidearm and firing at the creature's exposed back. The bullets tore into its flesh, and it let out a howl of pain. It spun around, swiping at him with a ferocity that sent him flying into a tree. Desperation fueled me as I kept firing. I aimed for its head, the only vulnerable spot I could think of. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring. I kept my finger on the trigger until the gun clicked empty. The creature staggered, its body twitching. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then with a final, defiant roar, it collapsed to the ground, its limbs warped in death. The rest of the team arrived, securing the area and tending to Simmons. Patterson looked at the fallen creature, his face grim. "Looks like we got one," he said, his voice a mix of relief and dread. "But there are still more out there." I glanced back at the creature, its lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. This was just the beginning. The forest still held many more horrors waiting to be unleashed. After the encounter with the creature, we regrouped at the crash site. Patterson debriefed us quickly, his voice calm but urgent. We were still on high alert when the call came in, a distress signal from a farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was our first civilian contact since the crash, and the urgency in the voice on the other end of the line left little doubt. We needed to move fast. The drive to the farmhouse was tense. The road was rough, the van jostling us around as we sped toward our destination. The team was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our minds replaying the nightmare we had just faced. We approached the farmhouse and piled out of the van, weapons ready. The farmhouse stood eerily still, its windows dark and uninviting. Patterson motioned for us to spread out. "Martinez, Simmons, take the perimeter. Campbell, you're with me. Let's move." The front door was open, creaking slightly as we pushed it open. The inside was a scene of chaos. Furniture was overturned, and the walls were splattered with dark, congealed blood. The bodies of animals, mostly cats and dogs, were strewn across the floor, their bodies mutilated. Jesus Christ, Patterson whispered. We moved through the house cautiously, stepping over the carcasses. The kitchen was a mess of broken dishes and more blood. And then we heard it, a faint whimpering coming from the basement. Patterson signaled for me to follow as he led the way down the narrow stairs. At the bottom, huddled in a corner, we found him, a lone farmer, his clothes torn and bloodied, his face a mask of terror. He looked up as we approached, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Sir, we're here to help," Patterson said gently, kneeling beside the man. "Can you tell us what happened?" The farmer's gaze slowly focused on us and he began to speak, his voice shaking. "It came out of nowhere, bigger than any man. It had the head of a goat, horns, glowing red eyes. It killed my animals, ripped them apart." "Did it hurt you?" I asked, scanning him for any signs of injury. The farmer shook his head, his hands trembling. "No, it didn't touch me. Just watched me. Then it went into the cornfield. I can still see its eyes in my mind." Patterson glanced at me, and I saw the same grim determination in his eyes that I felt. We needed to get this man to safety, and then track down this new threat. "All right," Patterson said, helping the farmer to his feet. "You're safe now. We're going to take you to HQ. You did good. Just stay with us." We guided the farmer back upstairs, past the scenes of carnage, and out to the van. Martinez and Simmons joined us, their faces grim. "Perimeter's clear," Simmons reported. "Whatever did this is long gone." "We have a direction," I said, pointing towards the cornfield. "It went that way." We loaded the farmer into the van, making sure he was secure and comfortable. His haunted eyes stared out at the fields as we sped away, his words replaying in my mind. A creature with the head of a goat, taller than any human, with a pair of twisted horns and glowing red eyes. Black scales and fur covering its body, goat-like legs, and hands ending in long, sharp talons. Back at HQ, we handed the farmer over to the medics and briefed the higher-ups on what we had learned. Patterson laid out the next steps, his voice steady but urgent. "We're going to set up a perimeter around the cornfield. This thing is dangerous, and it's still out there. We need to contain it before it can strike again." We arrived at the cornfield just before dawn, the first light of day barely cutting through the fog. The field stretched out in front of us, rows of tall stalks swaying gently. This was where our next nightmare awaited. Patterson gave the orders, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. We spread out and move in a grid pattern. Drones are up and scanning for thermal signals. Stay sharp and keep your radios on. We split into small teams, each taking a different section of the field. I moved with Simmons and Martinez, the stalks of corn closing around us like a living maze. The drones buzzed overhead, their cameras feeding back grainy thermal images. "Anything on the scanners?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Negative," Simmons replied. "Just the usual wildlife. Nothing big enough to be our target." As we pushed deeper into the field, the rows seemed to close in tighter. The radio crackled to life, Patterson's voice coming through. "Report in, everyone. Any signs?" "Negative," Martinez said, his eyes scanning the field around us. "Same here," Simmons added. The silence that followed was heavy. We knew this creature was out here somewhere, watching, waiting. The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice. "This is Alpha Team. We've got something on thermal. Movement to the west." Patterson's voice was sharp. "All teams converge on Alpha's position. Move fast." We turned and started making our way west, the cornfield becoming an endless maze. The stalks rustled and swayed, creating shadows that played tricks on the eyes. I kept my focus, scanning every inch for signs of movement. Then it started. A scream over the radio cut short. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of the chaos. "Alpha Team, report!" Patterson barked. No response, just static and then another scream, this one filled with pain and terror. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever was out there, it was picking us off one by one. The radio crackled with fragmented voices, shouts and screams that told me the other teams were facing horrors. Then, the sound I dreaded. Simmons' voice, cut off mid-sentence by a roar and a burst of static. "Simmons!" I shouted into the radio, but there was no reply. I was alone. I moved faster, my flashlight cutting through the stalks. The corn parted, revealing Simmons on the ground, his body broken. My stomach twisted at the sight. I looked around, my breath coming in sharp bursts. Then I saw it. A towering figure with the head of a goat, standing at 8 feet tall. Twisted horns and glowing red eyes, its body a horrifying mix of black scales and fur. It moved with lethal precision, stalking me silently. I raised my weapon and fired, the bullets hitting their mark but not slowing it down. It charged at me, and I threw myself to the side, feeling the rush of air as its talons sliced through the space where I'd just been. I scrambled to my feet, firing again. This time the bullet struck its face, and it howled in pain, a sound that traveled through the cornfield. It staggered, giving me a moment's respite. With adrenaline pumping, I aimed carefully and fired once more, hitting it squarely in the midsection. The creature roared and turned, retreating into the corn. I could hear its heavy breathing, the rustle of the stalks as it moved deeper into the field. The cornfield was eerily silent as I moved forward. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but rows upon rows of corn. The radio on my belt crackled with static, a reminder of how isolated I was. I kept moving, the grip on my rifle tight, knuckles white. I heard a faint noise to my left, like someone trying to stifle a cry. I veered towards it, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. I parted the stalks and found Martinez, slumped against a tree. He was injured but alive, his face a mask of pain. "Martinez, you all right?" I asked, kneeling beside him. He looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "It's out there, man! Took Simmons! It's hunting us!" I helped him to his feet, supporting his weight. "Can you walk?" He nodded weakly, and we began moving back towards the others. The radio crackled again, this time with Patterson's voice. "All units, converge on my location." We moved as quickly as we could, the cornfield closing in around us. Martinez stumbled, and I had to practically drag him along. We reached a small clearing where Patterson and a few other survivors were setting up a perimeter. "Campbell, Martinez, over here!" Patterson called out. We joined them, and Patterson gave us a quick once-over. "Glad you're alive. We're going to take this thing down, but we need to be smart about it." He handed out fresh ammo and set up the drones to give us a better view of the field. The thermal images showed a single heat signature moving erratically through the corn. It was injured, but still dangerous. "We spread out, keep it contained," Patterson ordered. "When it shows itself, we take it down." We moved into position, forming a loose circle around the heat signature. I could hear Martinez's labored breathing beside me, a stark reminder of how high the stakes were. Then, I saw the creature move through the corn with surprising stealth for its size. I raised my weapon, aiming for its goat head. "Fire!" Patterson's voice cut through the tension, and we all opened up. The clearing erupted with gunfire, bullets tearing through the corn and striking the demon. It roared in pain, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground. The demon charged, moving faster than I thought possible. It barreled towards Martinez, who barely had time to react. I fired again, hitting its shoulder and drawing its attention. The creature swung its massive arm, and I felt a sharp pain as it caught me in the side, sending me tumbling. Patterson and the others kept firing, their bullets finally finding their mark. The demon staggered, its movements becoming sluggish. It turned its rage towards Patterson, who stood his ground, firing shot after shot into the creature's chest. With a final, ear-splitting roar, it collapsed, body twitching in the dirt. We stood there, weapons still trained on the lifeless body, not daring to believe it was over. Patterson approached cautiously, his weapon ready. He kicked the demon's leg, and when it didn't move, he finally lowered his gun. "It's down," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We got it." We stood in the clearing, breathing heavily and staring at the lifeless body of the demon. The second demon was down, but the fight had taken its toll. Patterson's voice broke the silence. We need to get back to base, restock, and regroup. We made our way back to the van, each step heavy with exhaustion. The drive to HQ was somber, the weight of our losses, and the anticipation of what lay ahead hanging over us like a dark cloud. At the base, we quickly restocked our gear, grabbing fresh ammo and supplies. Soon after, we gathered in the briefing room. Patterson stood at the head of the table, a map spread out before him. We have a new lead. There's been a sighting of the third demon in an abandoned factory complex on the outskirts of town. This one's different. It's described as a blood-soaked knight with rusted spiked armor fused to its flesh. Its helmet is a grinning skull, and its eyes glow red. He paused, letting the description sink in. This demon wields a massive blood-stained sword and is highly skilled in combat. This will not be an easy fight. We listened in silence, the gravity of the situation clear. Patterson continued, We move out in 10. Get ready. The ride to the factory complex was tense. The sky had darkened, casting long shadows over the decrepit buildings. The complex was ahead, a maze of rusted metal and crumbling concrete. We disembarked, weapons at the ready. Patterson directed us to spread out and secure the perimeter. The drones buzzed overhead, their thermal cameras scanning for any signs of the demon. We moved through the complex, the sounds of our footsteps bouncing off the walls. The place was a wasteland, abandoned machinery and rusted pipes casting eerie shadows. Anything on thermal? Patterson's voice crackled over the radio. Negative, came the reply. Just cold metal and decay. We pressed on, the tension mounting with each step. I turned a corner and saw something. A fleeting glimpse of movement, a shadow darting behind a stack of crates. My heart raced as I raised my weapon, signaling to the others. Contact, I whispered into the radio. I saw something. North end of the complex. Patterson's voice came back, calm but urgent. All units converge on Campbell's position. Move cautiously. The team moved in, spreading out to cover all angles. We advanced slowly, weapons ready, eyes scanning the darkness. Then, a figure stepped out from the shadows, towering and menacing. It was the demon, the blood-soaked knight, its rusted armor glinting dully in the dim light. The grinning skull helmet stared at us, eyes glowing red. It held a massive sword, the blade stained dark with dried blood. The demon moved with intentional poise, its footsteps thundering through the empty factory. It turned its head, the skull face seeming to grin wider, as if mocking us. My grip tightened on my weapon. The radio crackled with Patterson's voice, calm but urgent. Take your positions! We need to surround it! We spread out, forming a loose circle around the demon. It stood there, almost daring us to make the first move. I aimed for the center mass, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. Fire! Patterson's order was like a gunshot itself, and we all opened up, the factory erupting with the sound of gunfire. The demon moved with blinding speed, deflecting bullets with its massive sword. It charged towards Peterson, who was closest, the blade cutting through the air with lethal precision. Peterson's scream was cut short as the sword cleaved through him, his body crumpling to the ground in a pool of blood. Fall back! Patterson yelled, but the demon was already among us, swinging its sword in wide arcs. Martinez tried to flank it, firing his shotgun at close range. The blasts hit the demon, but it barely flinched. With a swift motion, it decapitated Martinez, his head rolling across the floor as his body fell limp. I fired again, aiming for its head. The bullet struck the grinning skull helmet, chipping away at the bone, but doing little to slow it down. The demon turned towards me, its glowing red eyes locking onto mine. It charged, the ground shaking with each step. I dodged to the side, feeling the rush of air as its sword sliced past me, narrowly missing. Johnson, one of the newer team members, took the opportunity to unload his rifle into the demon's back. It roared in pain, the sound booming through the factory like a death knell. The demon swung its sword in a wide arc, catching Johnson in the side. He screamed, collapsing to the ground, blood pouring from the gaping wound. I rushed to his side, trying to drag him away. Patterson and the remaining team members fired continuously, their bullets finally starting to take a toll. The demon staggered, its movements becoming slower. I saw my chance and raised my weapon, aiming for the exposed flesh beneath its helmet. "Die, you bastard!" I shouted, pulling the trigger. The bullet hit its mark, and the demon let out a final, bone-chilling scream. It dropped to its knees, the sword clattering to the ground. Patterson approached cautiously, his weapon trained on the demon. "Keep firing!" he ordered, and we unloaded our remaining rounds into the creature. It convulsed, its body twitching violently before finally collapsing, lifeless. We stood there, panting and covered in sweat and blood. The factory was silent once more, the only sound our ragged breathing. I looked around at the devastation, at the bodies of my fallen comrades. Patterson put a hand on my shoulder, his face grim. "We got it," he said quietly. Johnson groaned, still alive but barely. I helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as we made our way out of the factory. As we exited the factory, the first light of dawn began to break through the darkness. The demon was down, but the fight had left us battered and broken. The aftermath of the final battle left us scarred in ways that would never fully heal. We made our way back to HQ in silence. The medics took Johnson immediately, rushing him to the infirmary. I followed in a daze, the events of the night replaying in my mind, each gruesome detail seared into my memory. The higher-ups gave their condolences, their faces masks of bureaucratic indifference. They would file their reports and move on to the next crisis. But for us, the survivors, the battle was far from over. Johnson survived his injuries, but he was never the same. The physical wounds healed, but the psychological scars ran deep. He was haunted by the memories of that night, plagued by nightmares and flashbacks. The once confident and steady soldier was now a shadow of his former self, jumpy and withdrawn. He eventually left the unit, unable to continue in the field. Last I heard, he was living in a small town upstate, trying to find some semblance of peace. I stayed with the Special Investigations Unit, but my perspective had changed. The horrors we faced had left a permanent mark. Each new mission brought a fresh wave of anxiety, a fear that we might encounter something even worse. I spent countless hours reviewing the data from our fights, analyzing every detail in the hopes of finding some clue, some understanding of what we had faced. The demons were intelligent, malevolent, and terrifyingly real. The thought that there might be more out there kept me awake at night, my overactive mind filled with possibilities. The factory complex was sealed off, declared a restricted zone. The official story was an industrial accident, but we knew the truth. The bodies of my fallen comrades were buried with full honors, but there was no closure, no sense of finality. The demons were gone, but their presence lingered, a shadow that would never fully dissipate. The world moved on, oblivious to the horrors, but we knew the truth. We were the guardians, the first line of defense against the darkness, and as long as we stood, we would keep fighting no matter the cost. In the end, the demons didn't win. But the victory came with a price, a burden we would carry for the rest of our lives. And in the quiet moments, when the memories threatened to overwhelm, I reminded myself of one simple truth. We survived, and that was enough.